Goedemorgen, dat is wel heel erg groot zo. Het is niet mijn grootste zaal, maar wel mijn grootste scherm, denk ik. Goedemorgen. I will do the rest in English. I speak Dutch, well, barely, but I will do the presentation in English because that's a lot easier for me. Hi, I'm Derick. I am European, originally from this country, but currently living in London. I am, well, or rather was, PHP 7.4's release manager. The job of a release manager is to make sure that nobody adds things to the language after we're not allowed to add things to the language anymore because of feature freeze. That and some packaging. It's not a really glamorous job at all. As part of my work, I work for the PHP Foundation, so I work some of the features that I'll be talking a little bit about today, this morning. I also wrote Xdebug, PHP's debugging extension. You might have heard of it. If not, go search for it on your favorite search engine. I like maps, beer, and whiskey. Irrelevant, but it allows me to put nice emojis on this big screen here. If you have any further questions, I can actually see the people in the audience, but I'm not sure how well the sound is going to travel. We'll give it a go. If you have questions, raise your hands. I should be able to spot you. Otherwise, you can find me on Mastodon later as well. But without further ado, we dive straight in. I guess I don't have to be worried that you can't read the slides today. So, although the title in the program says what's new in PHP 8.3, but it is really a bit tricky to talk just about PHP 8.3, because the features that we've started adding to the language are all sort of a progression of things. Also, we are now getting ready for PHP 8.4, so I thought it'd be fun to add a few possibilities that we might get in the next version as well. In PHP 8.0 or 8.1, we got read-only properties. So read-only properties basically prevent you from having to write this, right? You have to have a private property name in this case, and then you need to have a getter to be able to read that without people outside of your class being able to change that. And with PHP 8.1, we got this real keyword, the read-only keyword, that does these things for you, which is kind of nice. But you still had to do this for all of the properties that you had. And if you have many, that becomes annoying. So the read-only keyword itself is a bit weird anyway, because it doesn't really mean read-only, because if something is read-only, you can never write to it. So the better term for it is actually write once, but that's a bit of a silly term, so we call it read-only. So you can only write to this property only once, and only from the scope it was declared, so that tends to be your constructor or your factory methods to instantiate the objects. Now, from PHP 8.2, we got a read-only keyword for the whole class, so that all the properties in there are now read-only by default. But this keyword also does a few other things. Like, it also prevents dynamic properties from being created. So in PHP, you might know that if you have an object, you do arrow property name that you haven't declared equals value, it will add a new property to your class. So the read-only keyword on the class prevents you from doing that. Also, read-only keywords, they can only be used on cannot be used on untyped or static properties. You can only use them on normal class properties. And it also means that inherited classes must also be read-only. So you can't inherit this user class, but a class that isn't read-only. Somebody suggested changing that for PHP 8.3, so that you can also make inherited classes no longer read-only. But that request or this suggestion failed. Instead, what we got is a new feature for read-only classes, is that in your clone method, that I have here on the slide here, you can then override properties. So during the clone section, the clone magic function thingy here, the initialization makes sure that you can just override them again. So again, read-only is not the best name, but it's the best fitting name for us now. Now, I mentioned those dynamic properties. These are actually going to be phased out for PHP 9. So if you are PHP 8.2 or 8.3, you'll usually get a warning now if you create dynamic properties. Right, I said that. So in PHP 8.2, we introduced a warning for this. When you look at the voting record for it, I was the only one voting against it. I disagree with that now, so it's all good. It made it into the language. And I started upgrading my code to some of my code with, and run it on PHP 8.2 to see all the test works. And I had this bit of code, and of course that created an error message because somebody ended up not being me, having made a typo in the name of the property, right? So this actually found bugs almost straight away, and then of course I had to fix it. So yeah, these are kind of nice. In PHP 8.1, we also started introducing enumerations. Now, I don't want to talk about the whole thing about enumerations here because there's quite a lot into it. But there are some issues that you can't do with it sometimes. Like the enumeration defines basically two values, the GBP case as well as the EUR case, just to define your currency. The enumerations, they are typed, so if you want to pass an enumeration value, you need to type it with currency, not with a string that is back to it, which is a really nice way of having some extra type safety with different cases that a specific object can be. And I think I have an example later where this is now also used in PHP itself. However, sometimes what you wanted to do is you wanted to create an array somewhere, a constant array in this case, where you link a enumeration value with an actual value, and you can't do that in PHP 8.1. Also, you can't do it in PHP 8.2 either. But for PHP 8.3, we introduced this new syntax where you can basically access properties from, well, our original idea was to do it from all classes that you have, access that on your left-hand side, and then the value basically gives you the, how do you call it, the pound sign or the euro sign in this case, and then you can have an array again. So the intention was to make this work with all objects all over PHP, but we found that there's actually a lot of edge cases in there, and PHP internals have so many edge cases sometimes that it makes it hard to introduce features. So we ended up deciding that the only place where this is actually really useful is with enumerations, so you can only do this for enumeration values. Okay. In PHP 7.4, we introduced the ... operator. I know this is ages ago now. And what it basically would do is that it would include each element of the apples array in the fruits array. So you have your pear, your peach, your red apple, your green apple, your strawberry, and your tomato. And then you get a fruit salad. Those are actually really big. That's kind of funny. But the ... operator only worked in this case. But what it didn't work for was associative arrays. But we added that in PHP 8.1. So we added the ... operator basically does every element from this array, we put it in place now. And just like if you do array merge or with the plus sign, array keys in the further arrays will actually override elements that were already there. And you see that here. So although we have two green elements, only the second one wins, the one with the pear. And the green apple disappears. Now, these ... operators with associative arrays are actually useful in other places as well. They're useful in, what do you call it, name parameters. I'll get back to that in a moment. We also introduced something called a first-class callable syntax. If I run this code with only the red line, anybody wants to guess what this does? It will give you an error message, right? It will give you, it will give you an error message because when you call test, you do get private method, you get an array with this and private method. But when you then tried calling that, in that scope you don't have this because it's in the main body of the script. Even if it was an object, it would still not work because you're trying to call a private method outside of the class, which you can't do. And then there was already a syntax for this in PHP for a long, long time where you could do closure, : from callable, and then specify the same syntax, which is what made it work because the this now gets bound when you do the closure from callable. So at that moment, the thing that's being returned has already this bound, so you can call the private method on it. But that syntax is really annoying to use. So in PHP 8.1, we added the ... operator. We like using the ... operator for many different things. And it is basically just the same thing as the line above, but with better syntax. Now, it is actually just a syntactic sugar. It does the same thing in all the different cases. You can use it for normal functions, you can use it for method calls or from static methods, and basically all the other variants as well, and more that didn't fit on the slide. This syntactic sugar, I think we are looking at extending this by using or by adding partially applicate. I can't pronounce those words. We call them. The intention is that when you create these callables, that you already pre-fill in some of your values. So you can do this method. First argument is already passed, and then the other arguments can then be passed in when you then call the closure. Syntax like that. It's not made it into PHP yet, but we might see that somewhere in the future. We are looking into doing that as well. Now, in PHP 8.2, we've had proper types for quite some time by now, right? But there were some weird things in PHP's type system. Like we had false, but you could only use it as part of a union. You couldn't use it as a standalone type. So you could have string or false, but not just false. But you also couldn't use it with null. So you couldn't use null or false, but you had to use null or bool, which is of course not descriptive anymore. Also, you couldn't use null standalone, even though it's a narrower type than user or null, right? And that actually caused some issues. Like if you, for example, have a class like user finder here, if you do find user by email, you can either get the user object back or no user if the user wasn't found by that email address. But if you wanted to do some tests where you wanted to substitute that for an always null finder, just to make sure that it always returns null, you couldn't actually type for that because null alone you couldn't have as a type. And although you could have used void, but that means something else. That means a function never returns, whereas null means it always has to return a null value. So there's a lot of weird things in there. We only had string or false. We didn't have string or true either, because PHP didn't need that internally. So yeah, we had false or null, but not true, and that's a really big facepalm. I like it. So we didn't have any of these things, so we now, in PHP 8.2, we introduced the false type, the null type, and the true type, and you can all use them standalone as well. Now, they do behave a little bit different than normal types, because a normal type, if you are in non-strict type modes in a file, PHP will convert, like if a string contains a number, it will convert it to an integer, if that's what you type against. Or when you cast to a Boolean, it will either be true or false, depending on the value that you pass in. But if you specify either false, null, or true, then there's nothing to coerce, because coercing everything to false is kind of pointless, so PHP doesn't allow for that, and you get an actually type error, even though you're not in strict type mode. Now, we added many different combinations of types over the years. So in PHP 8.0, we got union types. Something needs to be either an integer or floating point number, which is kind of useful, especially when you have numbers like this here. Similarly, in PHP 8.1, we introduced pure intersection types. They are a way of making sure that a value, in most cases, implements more than one interface. So in this case, we want our countable iterator to implement both traversable and countable, which is kind of useful for iterator kind of things. But it still didn't allow for having something that implements two interfaces, or it's an array, for example, which is a common pattern you see in PHP. So for that, in PHP 8.2, we got this disjunctive normal form types, which is really hard to pronounce, so we call them DNF types instead, which basically allows you to have a union of intersections. So something needs to implement either something and something, or something else. Whereas this something else doesn't have to be a union, an intersection itself, which you tend to end up using lots for iterators, as an example here. You also sometimes see it in test cases and things like that. What you can't do is create a intersection of unions. So the pattern here is X and A or Y and B. What you can't have is X or A and Y or B. But if you look at this correctly, you can always rewrite it into this syntax, even though it might have to be a little bit more verbose. So we have no intention of adding this other thing back either. Now, one thing that I think would be very useful to have in the future is something where you can create a type alias so that you don't have to type array or traversable and countable every time. But it's kind of a tricky thing to do because you're probably aware that most people write one class per file. But if a type alias is also a class, because those things tend to be defined as such, then you basically have a line a single line in the file to define a type alias, which is kind of annoying. But the way how PHP works, especially with autoloading, that's sort of how you have to do it. Our alternative here is that if you want to make use of a type alias, you need to define the type alias in every file where you want to use that alias, which is a bit more annoying because then you need to make sure that they sync between different files if you use the type in different places. So sometimes I know we'd like to implement a feature, we don't necessarily know what the best way of doing it is, because it depends on how PHP is architectured under the hood, which is sometimes limiting, but also in most cases, I mean, we like how it works, and it works well so far. H2 introduces a new random extension. Who thought that creating random numbers was really hard? It is actually really hard to do this right. There's another issue in PHP, that PHP's random number generator, you could give it a seed number, and a seed number is basically a way of setting the random number generator in a specific state. So then if you give it the same seed, it will always return the same random numbers, which is actually a useful property in some cases. But PHP's random implementation was different from any other language, even though it looked the same, which is kind of annoying because that means that if you had to deal with different languages, create the same random number sequence, you couldn't because the algorithm to do so was different. So in H2 we introduced actual random number engines that implement specific specifications so that you can go around that. At the same time, we also added this randomizer class that provides a much better API for creating random numbers so that you don't have to do a rand yourself with 0 to 100, and if you want floating point numbers, you have to multiply it and so on. Because every time you do that kind of steps, you're likely not doing it right, mostly because you can't do it right, creating numbers. Now, in most cases, you don't actually have to specify the engine, and if you don't, you basically get PHP 8.1 and earlier behavior, which of course what we like, keeping backward compatibility as much as we can. But that's actually quite a useful bunch of things in here. Like getByte just gives you a set of 8 bytes. As you can see my result here. Similarly, there's a method of just getting an integer number between 1 and 100 inclusively. Or if you just want a random integer, you can go next int on it. One of the features that I kind of like is that you can use pick array keys. With pick array keys, you give the name of the array and then a number of how many array keys you want back, which is useful in picking things like this from this list, because otherwise, how would you do this, right? If you want to pick 2 elements out of the list, well, you first need to figure out your array keys. Then you need to shuffle them, and then you pick the first 2 out of that shuffled array, which is of course a lot more operations than you really need, because you know we only need to have 2 keys, and with this method you cannot pick those out. Same thing, you can do shuffle array, which does things in a much nicer way as well. And then we have shuffle bytes. That's to show you that it actually works. I can reload the slides, and you get a different fruit salad every time. In A3, we actually added a few things to the randomizer extension. So there's now a getBytes from string method, which you give a range of numbers and letters or whatever characters you want, and tell it how many of that set you want, in this case 16. And then, well, you get 16 random values from that list. They can also be duplicate in it, because it would, for each of these 16, pick a random number, or a random character in this case. You can use for things like this, where you use, where you need to create a random domain name or backup code or something like that. Also, we added a method for getting floating point numbers out of this as well. Sometimes it's important that you create a floating point number in between a range from, in my case, it's random coordinates. So you need to do from -90 to +90. And with the enumeration value at the end, you then specify whether these numbers can be included or not. And the way how you do random numbers with floating point numbers is actually a lot trickier than with integers, because the steps can differ depending on the range of numbers that you have to begin with. So here with this enumeration value, you can then use close, meaning include both numbers, well, possibly include both numbers in what you get back. Whereas if it means open, that number cannot be picked, but anything less than that number can be picked. Or if it's close open, then it's is the end number that cannot be included. Again, random latitudes and longitudes. If I press this often enough, we'll probably end up with the coordinates of the cinema, but I don't think we have enough time for that today. And some other fun things in H2 is something called sensitive parameters. So this feature was suggested by a person who works for a company which makes software that their customers install. There's a forum where these administrators of these installed software can help each other, and they would often post like stack traces or dumps when something had gone wrong, including their database passwords, their AWS keys, because everything ends up in these stack traces, which is actually really annoying because you end up leaking data, which you don't want to do. So he suggested to introduce this attribute called sensitive parameter. And if you put that in front of an argument to a function, then when you get an actual error, it doesn't show you the actual value, but it shows you a wrapped version of it. So it wraps these values only when you convert things to text, like we do here, with a sensitive parameter value class. So this is a way that anytime you convert a stack trace with arguments to a string for error messages, you will get not the actual value in there. So you can now safely dump this and share it with the world. We also have gone through many of PHP's APIs internally, MySQL Connect, anything else you can come up with that has any sort of secret information in it, like OpenSSL signing keys and stuff like that. We also have actively added the sensitive parameter keyword there. So it also does the same thing for internal functions in PHP. If you have Xdebug loaded, then you still get the sensitive parameter out of it, but it doesn't wrap it in this object because it doesn't need to do it, and it just saves me a little bit of time. If you're actually debugging the script, it also doesn't get wrapped, and you can actually get the actual value, because that's, I mean, if you have debug access to a server, then leaking a password is probably the least of your worries already, right? Because you can just run random code on machines. We get more attributes. We also get the override attribute. And the override attribute is actually useful. So if you look at this slide, if you look at my code, this is a unit test for, I don't know what it was for, logging tests. If you run this test, it will create a nice file for me, but it would never clean it up because I misspelled teardown. And you would never know because it is not invalid syntax. You just misspelled it. So PHP unit would never know to call this function because it just misspelled. So with A3, we get this override attribute here, and then you quickly find out that I misspelled it. And what this override keyword requires you to do is we'll actually check whether the method that you're defining, that is actually does have a method defined in either an interface that you're implementing or an abstract class or your parent class. And if it doesn't, it will throw you an error. And I don't exactly know which one, but you'll get an error out of that. And actually, for this kind of cases, it's actually really useful. Now, it does mean that you need to add the override keyword yourself to many different places. But I'm pretty sure that our tools like Rector can help you do that for you. I found this particularly useful for these unit tests where sometimes you don't know whether things are going to get cleaned up. Question over there, yes.
If you misspelled teardown,
yes.
How can the Rector know that this has to override that method?
Well, that is a good question. The question is, if I had misspelled teardown, how would Rector know to add the keyword? And of course, it can't know that. But it is kind of useful for upgrading your code that you already have, so that if you copy things from there forward, you don't have the same issues. It helps a little bit, but it's of course not the silver bullet for making sure you don't have typos everywhere. So this is just one of the examples. I'm sure there's more as well. Now, PHP 8.3 also introduced typed class constants. Previously, if you have an interface, you do class foo implements I, and then bar extends foo. PHP would just allow that. So basically what happens here is that the type of the test constant changes 2 times. Now, is this a problem? Sometimes not, but in other cases it can be. So what we have in A3 is we now have this class constant type, which then enforces that everything that it implements it or inherits from it has the same type. So this will now throw a error, a fatal error. Interestingly, when I first wrote this slide, it didn't give me an error. I was wondering, maybe I don't have the latest version of PHP. No, I did. It actually ended up being a bug that in specific cases with interfaces, it wasn't actually checked for. So sometimes writing slides for presentations fixes bugs in PHP, which I was quite happy about. Now, there's lots of different ways of doing dynamic fetches of properties and things like that. You have probably once in a while used variables. Luckily, you don't see that as much anymore as you used to be. But accessing a dynamic property is something that you use quite a bit, right? You use $foo, arrow, $bar, and then bar is a value containing a string that has the name of your property. And PHP supported that for basically all of its different element types, but it wouldn't do it for class constants. Why not? Well, maybe because nobody's ever thought about adding that to the language. It's an old language. It has grown on us and grown with us, but it also means that sometimes there's just weird things in it, which we are slowly but surely trying to clean up to make it a lot better. So in A3 we now have a possibility of doing this. There's now class constants which you can do with $foo, : and then between the curly braces, the name of your class constants. So in this case, to bar, we set the name bar in capitals. If you don't echo foo, : openings, curly bracket bar, then it substitutes the contents of the constant with what it was. Interestingly, this also works for the magic class constant. If you ever seen this, if you have the name of a class in PHP, say foo, and you do : class, it will substitute that in as a string for the name of the class. But that is something that isn't actually implemented in the engine itself. This is implemented in the parser. So if the parser sees this : class thing, it already substituted that before it even gets to code generation or internal code generation. However, because this is not an actual constant, we actually had to add a special case for making that work with our dynamic class constant fetches as well. But it does work, of course. Now, I'm sure you have used static at some point on methods, but have any of you ever used static on variables inside a method or function? It's unlikely that many of you have done that. But the way how it was implemented was actually kind of weird, because anytime you did static I equals value, if you did this one more time, it would just ignore the first one. And it didn't matter where in the function these were. It's just where you had declared them, even they were not executed, it would just overwrite the first one when you call a function for the first time. What you also couldn't do is use the return value of a function or method as your static initialization value. So before PHP 8.3, you couldn't do this, it would throw a parse error. But now in 8.3, we clean this up. You can't do static variable of the same variable name more than once. And also it is guaranteed to always be executed once when the function or method gets called for the first time. So the output of this is going to be begin. That's where the echo is. First time we call foo, the static I will get initialized with the return value of bar. And of course we then get bar called, but you don't get that for subsequent invocations of foo. This actually a pattern with static variables you sometimes see in like lazy loading of database or other resources, because it only ends up doing the tricky thing when it needs to do that for the first time. So bar, this function could be a database query, for example, or things like that. And then it could cache that information so then the next time you call foo, it wouldn't have to go back to the database to call this function. So it's kind of an interesting pattern to use here. PHP 8.3 as well, we get a function called JSON validate. And JSON validate implements PHP's JSON parser. It actually uses the same parser, but it doesn't build up in memory the values of what the JSON file has. So sometimes you end up in a situation where you need to make sure you validate a very big JSON file, hundreds of thousands of lines sometimes, for storage to do something with later. But in order to make sure that file was valid, you had to parse it, and it would create everything in memory, creating a lot of overhead that you didn't need. So with A3, there's now a JSON validate function that does do the validation without storing things in memory. It makes no sense to use if the next function call is going to be JSON decode, because you basically end up parsing the file twice. You get the same errors out of this as from JSON decode as well, or JSON decode if you want to pronounce it that way. So the result of this is like I'm throwing in JSON validate for a valid JSON string, and then the second one isn't invalid, so it returns false. You get a code out of it, which the code error then links to the message syntax error. To be honest, syntax error is kind of useless, because if you have a JSON file with 100,000 lines and it says syntax error, then which of those lines in the file is this? So hopefully we'll get some better information out of this JSON validate function at some point as well, because that'd be really useful. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about PHP 8.4. So I have to say that although PHP 8.4 is not released yet, that also means that these slides might not be true by the time it does get released. But I think one that has been voted on and already been merged is this new feature for parsing HTML5. PHP for a long time has had a DOM extension. The DOM extension you could do load XML file, but it also had a load HTML file, which implements an HTML parser, but the HTML that it parses is HTML4, which hopefully almost none of you use anymore in current projects, right? It's just an outdated standard. And it is kind of important to parse HTML according to the standard that people are using, because sometimes the fallbacks, the error situations are handled differently in HTML4 and HTML5. So we originally thought like, well, we should just fix this and change load HTML to parse HTML5, but of course people that are relying on the parsing HTML4 will then have an issue. So, and we don't like disappointing people by breaking their codes or their HTML validation, because that can sometimes be a scary thing to do. Also, the library that PHP uses under the hood, libxml, doesn't implement HTML5 parsing anyway. But we still think it's important, so one of our developers came up with a way of getting around this. By creating a new namespace called DOM, it's called the DOM extension, Document Object Model. By creating two final classes in there, one is called XML document and the other one is called HTML document. And these are basically a wrapper around the old DOM document class with specific methods and validation for XML in the XML document or in DOM/XML document, as well as for DOM/HTML document, which will now be a HTML5 parser and not an HTML4 parser. By having a mechanism like this and aliasing DOM document to DOM/document, we'll end up having a wrapper around this by being able to use HTML5 parsing. But at the same time, it'd still be a drop-in replacement for what you currently have, so you wouldn't have to change your code if you want to opt in into the HTML5 parser. The similar thing, we also have XML document, which originally we didn't want to change anything with, but it turned out that the PHP implementation of the XML parser didn't actually follow the specification correctly, which is annoying, but also because we don't want to break people's current use of the wrong specification, we left the original XML document class in place, but now we can fix all of these things in the wrapped version of it, because in order to make use of that, you'll have to opt into doing that. So we're getting more out of this abstraction wrapping than we originally thought. All right. PHP 8.0 was basically called PHP 8.0 because, and not PHP 7.5, because we introduced a JIT engine. A JIT engine is a way of making sure that PHP runs not through its interpreter, going over the lines or going over the statement step by step, but instead convert that to something that runs directly on the CPU by using assembly and stuff like that. But the way how this was implemented was not 100% optimal. So in PHP, every function body is looked at it on its own. It gets converted internally to something we call an operary. And the JIT engine can optimize single operaries. Now the problem is the moment you call another function from optimized code, you have to come out of the optimized code that runs on your CPU and go back into the interpreter. That overhead almost wipes away running non-JITted code. So the JIT engine only really makes a lot of sense if you have a bunch of code where you don't really call many other functions. So specific algorithms, for example, with a few exceptions, because some functions in PHP aren't what they are. Things like strlen, for example, or array count, although they look like functions, they actually are specialized in the engine, so that it isn't an actual function that is being called. So these you could still use in JITted code without having the penalty. A similar issue is that this JIT engine only really worked on the AMD 64 platform. So nowadays, more people are starting to use ARM64, and that basically meant that the whole optimization engine had to be rewritten. And these are basically hard coding assembly code in the PHP engine, which first of all is really hard to do. Also, there's only one person that knew how it worked, which isn't great for language, because if this people disappears for whatever reason, then nobody knows how to maintain it anymore. So PHP 8.4 now has a new JIT engine. As a user, you're not going to really notice this happening, except that some more code now will be able to be optimized because it is more clever of not having to break out to calling original PHP functions again. Separately, there's now two stages to it. The first one is the one that converts PHP code to this intermediate representation, and that can then be targeted much more easily for different CPU types. So the architecture is a lot better. It's also now mostly documented, which is also useful for other people to want to work on this as well, because basically any bit of PHP internals, more than one people should know how it works. Preferably more than 4 or 5, but for some bits of the code, that's still not the case, unfortunately. As a user, you're not going to notice any of this much, except that things might actually run a little bit faster, again, without you having to do anything. What we also changed is the default setting of how to enable the JIT engine. So in PHP 8.0, you turn on the JIT engine, not actually by using opcache JIT equals on, but by also allocating memory for it. So the default value of JIT buffer size is 0, which is just a really odd way of doing it. So in 8.4, the defaults are still going to be the same. They're still going to be off, but you now turn the JIT engine off, not by setting your memory to 0, but just setting JIT to off, which makes a lot more sense to do. Yeah, we've chosen for the JIT engine to be opt-in, because this is sort of still slightly experimental, and because the implementation of so much of PHP syntax in a new language, in assembly language, it doesn't always necessarily produce the same results. It should, but of course, if there's two parallel engines that are running, they can have slightly different bugs to each other. So that's why we didn't enable this by default, and it is an opt-in feature, and still is. Will we change it in PHP 9? Who knows? But also, I also can't say when PHP 9 is coming out either. Other things we're getting in PHP 8.4 is PDO subclasses. Previously, any database connection that you made with PDO, you would always interact with through a PDO class. And this PDO class had methods defined on it that were only useful for specific databases only. Like SQLite has a way of registering functions with the database, but that only would work on SQLite. But the method was still on the generic PDO object, which makes no sense as an API. So from 8.4, each of the different databases that PDO supports now has its own class name that wraps that. If you still do normal new PDO, you won't get the benefit out of that because that could break people's code. So in order to opt into this feature, you have to use PDO : connect, which is then a factory method to return a PDO object of the class that depends on which database you're connecting to. I think this is one of these nice additional features that doesn't really give a lot of benefit, but is sort of a nice cleanup. It makes PHP's APIs themselves cleaner. Now this one is a little bit more controversial, which are called property hooks. And property hooks are currently being discussed. So I don't necessarily can guarantee that this will make it into the language. I think it will, but I can't give you an accurate assessment of whether that will actually happen. So the idea behind it is that you can define properties, and without having to use __get or __ set to do some extra logic, writing to a property or reading from it, you get to define these property hooks, in this case get and set. Get will get called, or the code that associated will get called when you're reading a property. So in this case, the result of reading full name means you get the result of the expression this first, adding a space, and then adding this last. Similarly, for set, you get to do the same thing. And the syntax for set is the same as for get, but you get to use the curly braces if you need more than one statement. So if you write to the full name property, the first thing it does is then splits the name that you gave by space, so that you have first and last again. And then secondly, that then also assigns the values to this first and this last. And then additionally, we also set the isModified property to true as well. So the full name property here is because the name isn't used anywhere in its implementation in the hooks. It isn't an actual property. It doesn't get space allocated for it because it isn't an actual property. It ends up being a virtual property. Exactly how we're going to want to make virtual properties work, we're not 100% certain yet, but I'm pretty sure that the code on this slide will still run next year when PHP 8.4 gets released at the end of this year. I think this is kind of a nice feature. But it adds quite a lot of more syntax that you'd have to think of, because you have get and set as property hooks now. You can actually also put those in the promoted properties in your construct definition. And that, of course, makes the syntax in there really quite complicated sometimes. Additionally, you can, of course, define it separately, like I've done here in this example here. So there's lots of different new syntaxes that suddenly might show up. Now, is this functionality you should use for every class with properties? Probably not. But in some cases where this is really useful, I think this is actually a much nicer way than having to declare your properties private and then using getters and setters by hand and implementing those yourself compared to doing this. There's also quite a lot of internal issues here where we need to make sure that inheritance works as well. So normally you can't change the type of a property in PHP in an inherited class. It has to be the same type because it implements both read and write. Whereas if a interface would say that a property only needs to implement get, then technically something that implements this interface can have a different set of rules or inheritance rules, or how do you call these? Property protection rules for the set as well. So you get to mix and match these a little bit as well. Whether the asymmetric visibility will make it into PHP 8.4, I don't know yet either. So lots of things that are still coming up. There will be more features added to PHP 8.4. The next time I give a variant of this presentation, there will be more slides with PHP 8.4, so you can keep an eye out for that as well. I think I am done with what I had to talk about this morning. Nicely on time, I think. We have maybe a minute or two for questions, but if not, come and find me during the rest of the conference. That might be hard because there's 900 of us, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions. For once, the QR code is big enough that people can scan it all the way back to the back of the room. It will give you a link to my slides, and once I get home, I will also add a few links to extra resources so that you can read up on some of the new features that might make it into PHP or might not make it into PHP as well. So if there's any questions, I'm happy to take a few. If you don't want to do it from all the way back, because I will not be able to hear you, I will also be around here for a few minutes as well, until the next talk. So with that, I would say thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the conference.